My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old, and I'm a bookkeeper. For 5 years, I worked the same job, kept the same budget, and saved every dollar I could. Not because I had big dreams I talked about at dinner. I had big plans I kept to myself, and inside a spreadsheet no one asked to see. The day I signed the papers on an abandoned gas station in Harlan County, Kentucky, my family was waiting for me on the sidewalk outside the title company. Not to celebrate, not to hand me a card. They were there to talk me out of it. My brother Derek was in his white coat. He had come straight from the hospital to make sure I knew what he thought of me. He looked at me the way you look at someone you've already written off, and he said, "You're a hopeless failure." I signed anyway. 1 week later, I found a locked storage room in the back of that property, sealed with a padlock that hadn't been touched since January of 1992. Inside that room was a safe. Inside that safe was a contract that changed everything. $920,000 from a $47,500 purchase in 23 days. I want to tell you how that happened, and I want to tell you what it cost me to get there, because none of it started with the gas station. It started much earlier. Let me take you back to where this really began. I am, in my family, the invisible one. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean it in the specific, practical sense of the word. I am the person in the room whose presence is assumed and whose absence would be noticed only when something stopped working. I make the spreadsheets. I track the expenses. When my dad's rental property had a billing dispute with the county assessor's office, I handled it. When my mom needed to understand her pension statement, I sat with her for 2 hours at the kitchen table and walked her through every line. When Derek decided at 28 that he was going to buy into a medical practice, I was the one who built his financial model. I told him where the risk was. I told him what assumptions were aggressive. He thanked me with a text message that said, "Looks good, sis." That's what I am. The one who looks things over and says, "Looks good." 3 months before the gas station, my dad sat Derek and my 2 uncles, Paul and Roy, down at that same kitchen table and told them about the investment group he was putting together. Commercial real estate, a portfolio they'd build quietly, over time, with pooled capital. Smart money, he called it. A family legacy. I found out from Derek 4 days later, the way you find out about things you weren't supposed to find out about at all. I asked why I wasn't included. Derek said, "Claire, you don't have the investor profile." I didn't ask what that meant. I knew what it meant. I had been making their investor profiles for 3 years, for free, and not one of them had ever asked what mine might look like. I remember sitting at my desk at 11 that night. The apartment was quiet. My coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago, and I hadn't noticed. I had a spreadsheet open, and I was running a calculation I hadn't run in a while. 5 years, every month, what I'd set aside. The number on the screen was $51,200. That was more than enough for the investment group. They hadn't asked. I didn't cry. I just looked at the number, and then I closed the spreadsheet. And I thought, fine, I'll find my own thing. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being useful. People assume that if you're the one handling things, you must want to be. They never think to ask whether you'd like someone to handle something for you, just once. I had been the one who handled things for so long that I think my family genuinely believed I didn't need anything. I had become to them a function, reliable, background, always there. Not someone who wanted a seat at the table, just someone who said it. 2 weeks later, I was going through the county tax auction listings the way I did every few months, mostly out of habit, and I found it. Harlan County, parcel the 4th of July 115. A gas station and attached convenience store on Route 421, operating name Bluebell Road Fuel. Last active owner, Thomas Rudd, declared missing January 1992. No legal heirs on record. Current tax delinquency, 8 years. The listing photos were what everyone else saw. rust on the pump canopies, the sign for the convenience store leaning at a 30-degree angle, weeds pushing through every crack in the asphalt. A property that looked like it had given up. I looked at those photos, and then I went to the county assessor's records. I pulled the full parcel history, and buried in a footnote on a 1991 filing, I found something that made me sit up straight in my chair. There was a notation in the county records of a subsurface access rights agreement between Thomas Rudd and a regional petroleum company, signed in 1991 and listed as unexecuted, pending owner signature on the final transfer documents. The company name was Appalachian Basin Resources. Thomas Rudd had disappeared in January of 1992. The agreement had never been finalized, but it also had never been dissolved. I stared at that notation for a long time. Everyone else who looked at this listing saw the rest. I saw a contract that had been sitting in a courthouse database for 30 years, attached to a piece of land that was about to go up for $47,500 at a county tax auction. And I thought, that contract either died with the owner's disappearance, or it didn't. I spent the next 2 weeks finding out. I read every piece of Kentucky mineral rights case law I could access. I called 3 different attorneys before I found Donna Trevino, who specialized in property and mineral rights in eastern Kentucky, and who, when I explained what I'd found, went quiet for a moment and then said, "Don't bid on that yet. Let me pull the records first." Donna called me back in 3 days. "The agreement notation is real," she said. "The company is still active. If the contract terms hold and it runs with the land, the new owner inherits the access rights and whatever retroactive fees have accrued. But, Claire, we don't know what's in the final document. We don't know if a final document exists." "Something has to exist," I said. "Thomas Rudd signed a preliminary agreement. He didn't disappear until 8 months later. He was still running that station." "Then it might be in the property," Donna said. I wrote the name Appalachian Basin Resources in my notebook and underlined it twice. Then I registered for the auction. I made the mistake of mentioning it to my mom. I wasn't asking for permission. I just said casually that I was bidding on a property in Harlan County. I thought she might be curious. By the next morning, my dad had called. Then Derek again. Then my Uncle Paul. Then my Uncle Roy. Then my dad again, with my mom on the line. 7 calls in 2 days, and I didn't answer a single one because I already knew what all 7 of them were going to say, and none of them were going to say anything new. 7 calls to talk me out of this. In 5 years, there had been 0 calls to ask how I was doing or whether I needed anything. I went back to my notes. I wrote down everything I knew about Appalachian Basin Resources. I wrote down the contract date, the parcel number, the attorney of record from 1991. I filled 2 pages. Then I drove to Harlan County, and I walked the property alone on a Tuesday afternoon in November, in boots I hadn't worn since college. The pumps were old style, the canopy rusted through in 2 places. The convenience store was still structurally sound, and around the back, behind the store, there was a door with a padlock on it. The padlock was old. The shackle had started to rust. Stamped into the metal plate above the latch were the letters and numbers, JAN 92. I tried the padlock. It didn't move. I drove home and registered the locksmith appointment for the morning after closing. The auction was on a Thursday. Closing was set for the following Monday morning at the title company in Harlan, 9 o'clock. I wore a navy blazer and flat shoes, which is what I wear when I want to feel steady without looking like I'm trying. I drove myself. I expected to park and walk in and sign and drive home. When I turned the corner onto Main Street, I saw my dad's silver Buick parked in front of the title company, and Derek's car, and my Uncle Paul's truck. They were standing on the sidewalk. My dad, my mom, Derek, Paul, and Roy. 5 of them, arranged like they were waiting for a verdict to come down. My mom had her hands clasped in front of her. Derek was in his white coat. He had come from the hospital, or he wanted me to think he had. I parked. I walked toward the door. My dad said, "Claire, this is not too late to stop." I said, "I know." Derek stepped forward. He had a look on his face that I recognized from every family dinner where he'd explained something to someone who he didn't think was smart enough to understand. He said, "You're throwing everything you saved at an abandoned gas station. You're a hopeless failure." I counted to 10, not out loud, mentally, the way I always count when I need a second before I say something I can't take back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then I turned away from him and walked through the door. The woman at the closing desk had kind eyes and a thermos of coffee on her desk. The papers were in a neat stack. The room smelled like paper and the faint chemical trace of fresh ink. I sat down. I picked up the pen. I signed every page. The closing coordinator slid each document across the table, one at a time, and explained what each one was. Deed transfer, title insurance acknowledgement, tax disclosure. I read every line. I didn't skim. That was the thing about me that nobody understood. I read what I signed. I always had. When I walked back out, my family was still on the sidewalk. My dad had his hands in his coat pockets. My mom was looking at her shoes. Derek had his arms crossed. None of them said anything as I passed. I walked to my car, got in, and drove the 40 minutes home without the radio on. Has someone who was supposed to be in your corner ever chosen at exactly the wrong moment to tear you down instead? I'd really like to know in the comments what you did. The first 3 days at the property, I worked mostly alone. Ruth Calloway, who owned the small rental house next door, and who had been watching the old station with the quiet vigilance of someone who genuinely cared what happened to the neighborhood, came over on the second morning with a broom and a thermos of her own coffee, and just started sweeping. I didn't ask her to, she didn't explain herself. Some people are just like that. We swept and bagged and hauled. We opened the windows of the convenience store, and the November air moved through the space for what I suspected was the first time in years. On the third afternoon, I came around the back of the building to the door with the padlock. I stood in front of it for a moment. The padlock had a faint orange tinge of rust along the bottom of the shackle. The stamped letters above the latch were exactly as I remembered them. JAN 92. I had the locksmith's number saved. I called and moved the appointment to the next morning. What would you have done? Would you have opened that door alone in the middle of an empty property, or would you have called someone first? Tell me in the comments. The locksmith's name was Brian. He was there at 8 in the morning and had the padlock off in under 4 minutes. He handed me the lock, said, "Good luck with the place," and drove away. I stood in front of the open door. The storage room was larger than I'd expected from the outside. The walls were lined with metal shelving. There were cases of motor oil stacked 3 high, still in their original boxes, the brand name a regional distributor that I later looked up and found had been acquired and folded into a national chain in 1996. There was a motorcycle under a canvas tarp in the far right corner. The tarp had gone stiff and gray with decades of dust. And on the back wall, on the floor below the last shelf, was a safe. Small, about the size of a shoebox, with a dial combination lock on the front. The metal was a dull olive green. I photographed it from 3 angles with my phone. On top of the improvised wooden desk in the corner, there was an enamel mug, white, with a logo I couldn't fully make out because the glaze had faded almost completely, chipped along the rim on one side. It was sitting there as though someone had set it down to go get a refill and had never come back. I picked up the mug. I set it back down. I called Donna. "I found a safe," I said. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Don't touch it. I'm coming." Donna arrived 2 days later with a safe technician named Marcus and a small video camera that she set up on the desk tripod, pointing at the safe. She put on latex gloves. Marcus had the safe open in 11 minutes. Inside, a manila folder with an operations log, handwritten, covering October 1990 through December 1991. A second folder, this one labeled in neat capital letters, Subsurface Access Agreement, Appalachian Basin Resources, September 1991. And under both folders, a copy of the original property deed, surveyed and recorded in 1988, showing the lot boundaries of parcel 4th of July 115. The boundary line on the eastern side extended approximately 40 feet past the chain-link fence that currently marked the edge of the property, well into what was now the parking lot of a commercial strip development built in the late 1990s. Donna read in silence. I could hear the safe technician packing his tools behind me. After 2 minutes, Donna looked up. The subsurface agreement, she said, has a clause that reads, "This agreement and all rights herein shall run with the land and transfer automatically to any subsequent lawful owner of the parcel. There are also penalty provisions for each calendar year of non-access, which would have begun accruing when the station closed." She paused. "And the deed boundary is recorded. It's not an estimate. It's a surveyed line." I said, "What does that mean for me?" She said, "It means you're going to need a mineral rights specialist and patience." I heard the word patience. Not impossible. Not good luck. Patience. There's a difference. I drove home that afternoon and made dinner and sat at my kitchen table and didn't tell anyone what had been in that safe. I ate my food and cleaned my plate and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I had spent my whole adult life being the steady one, the quiet one, the one who didn't make things dramatic. I was very good at it. And for the first time, that quality was working entirely in my favor. I went to the station every day that week. I swept, I measured, I made a list of what the convenience store would need to reopen. I did not tell my family anything. Donna contacted Appalachian Basin Resources through their legal department. They came back within 48 hours. They knew the contract. Apparently, it had been on their books as an unresolved asset for 3 decades, with no owner to contact. When Donna told them the property had a new owner and that the new owner had the original signed agreement in hand, they asked for a meeting. 3 days after the safe was opened, Donna called me with the initial offer from the petroleum company, a lump sum settlement for retroactive access fees covering 30 years of inactivity under the agreement, plus a going-forward access arrangement. The lump sum figure they proposed was $265,000. Donna recommended countering. I said, "What do you think we can get?" She said, "310, maybe more." I said, "Counter at 310. They accepted within 24 hours. I wrote the number $310,000 in my notebook. Then I put the notebook down and walked to the back room and looked at the enamel mug on the desk and counted the number 3 times in my head before I was sure I hadn't misheard. Hopeless failure. I counted that number 3 times before I believed it. The developer question took a few more days. Donna reached out to the title company that handled the strip mall's original construction and asked them to pull their boundary survey. When they compared it against Thomas Rudd's 1988 deed, there was an approximately 38-foot wide strip along the eastern edge of the commercial property that was legally part of parcel the 4th of July 115. It had been built on, paved over, and used for 25 years without anyone ever noticing the discrepancy. Donna said, "You don't have to sell it. You can hold it and collect encroachment damages, but if you sell the strip, the number will be significant." I thought about it for 1 day. Then I called the developer directly. A week after I bought the gas station, Jenna, Derek's wife, drove past Donna's office on her way to pick up Lily from school. She saw my car in the parking lot. She took a photo and sent it to Derek. Derek called me that evening. For the first time in 2 weeks, I answered. He said, "You were at a lawyer's office. What did you do?" I let the silence sit for a few seconds before I answered. He had called to find out what I'd done. Not, "How are you?" Not, "Is everything okay?" Not, "Do you need anything?" He called to find out if I had done something that might matter. I told him I was handling some paperwork on the property, that it was fine, that I'd be in touch. The Saturday after closing, at 8:15 in the morning, I was on my knees in the convenience store, measuring the shelving units with a tape measure, when I heard cars pull up out front. I looked through the window. My dad's silver Buick, Derek's car, my mom, my Uncle Paul, my Uncle Roy. 5 of them, standing outside the chain-link fence, looking in. I put down the tape measure. I wiped my hands on my work apron. I walked to the fence. My dad spoke first. "Claire, the family has been talking." Derek said, "Family shares what's good." My dad said, "Smart people know when to ask family for help." I looked at Derek. I looked at my dad. I looked at my mom, who was standing slightly behind my dad with her arms crossed and her eyes on the ground. I reached into the front pocket of my apron and took out a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. It had 2 numbers on it. I read them out loud. $310,000 from Appalachian Basin Resources. $610,000 from the developer for the Eastern Strip. That is $920,000 from a $47,500 auction purchase. I held up the deed copy. This property is in my name. Only my name. 6 seconds of silence. Derek's jaw moved once, like he was going to say something, and then it didn't. My dad looked at the paper. Then he looked at me. The phrase, "smart people know when to ask family for help," did not come out of his mouth again. The morning sun was behind them. I could see, past their shoulders, the storage room door standing open, and through it, the old desk and the enamel mug, sitting right where I'd left it. 2 days later, my dad came back alone. He came in the early afternoon while I was working at the desk inside, and he knocked on the frame of the open front door. He looked smaller than usual, or maybe I was just seeing him differently. He sat down across from me, and he said, after a moment, "The family's investment group has had some difficulties." He was quiet. "There are some debts. I was wondering if you might be able to—" I said, "Dad." He stopped. I was standing on that sidewalk outside the title company, and Derek looked me in the face and called me a hopeless failure, and you were standing right there. He didn't say anything. I got up and poured 2 cups of coffee. I gave him one, in a plain ceramic mug. The enamel mug I kept for myself. I sat back down. "When you're ready to sit down with me and there's no money on the table between us," I said, "I'll be here. I mean that." He held the mug for 6 minutes. Then he stood up, set it on the desk, thanked me for the coffee, and walked out. He did not ask for money. He did not promise anything. Neither did I. The petroleum company's settlement check cleared in the 3rd week. The strip sale to the developer closed shortly after. The final combined amount was $920,000, which, after Donna's fees and applicable taxes, left me in a position I had never been in before. I kept the gas station. I hired a manager, a quiet man named Eddie, who had worked at a station 2 towns over and who knew the equipment better than anyone I could have found. We replaced the pumps. We restocked the convenience store with regional brands and a decent coffee station. Ruth Calloway came in every morning for her coffee and told everyone in the county what she'd seen happen over the past 3 weeks. Small towns are like that. The contractor I hired to survey the full property told me the old Bluebell Road fuel was in better structural shape than it looked. "These old stations," he said, "they built them to last. People just stopped looking at them." I understood what he meant. Lily came to see me on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after closing. Jenna brought her. They pulled into the lot, and Lily ran across the asphalt with a piece of paper in her hand, folded in half. She handed it to me with both hands. It was a drawing in crayon. A gas station with 2 pumps, a figure with brown hair standing in front of it. At the top, in careful capital letters that were still learning how to stay on the line, "Aunt Claire is the best." I folded it carefully and put it in my shirt pocket. Jenna stood a few feet back. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry." Just those 2 words, not on Derek's behalf, for herself, for standing on a sidewalk and not saying anything. I said, "I know. Thank you, Jenna." Lily visited the station 6 times in the 3 weeks that followed. She liked the coffee machine. She liked to watch the pump numbers spin. She asked me once why the old mug on the desk was chipped, and I told her I didn't know, that the man who owned it had left before he could explain, and she nodded like that made perfect sense. Do you think Derek will ever come back and say the words? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every one. It's been a few weeks now since I signed those papers, longer since any of this started. I sit at the old desk sometimes, in the late afternoon when the station is quiet and Eddie has things handled out front, and I hold the enamel mug in both hands, the way you hold something warm when the air is cold. The mug belongs here. I don't know where Thomas Rudd went. I don't know if he ever found out what he'd left behind. But I think about the fact that he built something careful and specific, filed his contracts, recorded his deed correctly, and then one day in January of 1992, he didn't come back. And for 30 years, everything he did sat still and waited. It waited for someone who would bother to read the footnotes. $920,000 from $47,500 in 23 days. They had 30 years to find what was in that safe. Derek hasn't apologized. The offer I made my dad stands. I don't know what either of them will choose, and I've stopped calculating that particular number. Here is what I want you to take from this, and I mean it simply. The people who called you a failure were measuring you in the wrong unit. They were measuring you in visibility, in volume, in the confidence of someone who already has what they want. They were not measuring you in patience. They were not measuring you in precision. They were not measuring you in the ability to read a county assessor's record at midnight and recognize an anomaly that had been invisible to everyone else for 3 decades. Your worth has never been about whether the people in the room chose to see it. I was always the one who paid, who fixed things, who stayed quiet. The family never asked what I needed. And it turns out what I needed was a $47,500 abandoned gas station in Harlan County, Kentucky, and a padlock that hadn't been touched since 1992. Some things wait for the right person.